Well, good evening, everyone. We have to acknowledge, I think, right off the bat that our numbers are a little depleted tonight, although we don't want to put too fine a point on that, do we? So thank you all for braving whatever it is you braved to get here, and I hope you washed your hands before you came into the room. It's a real pleasure to be able to host this discussion evening tonight. This is Science on the Front Line at the Royal Society. Part of the British Science Week, an event that's part of that British Science Week. I'm Professor Mark Pagel. I'm an evolutionary biologist and a fellow of the Royal Society here, and I'll be the host tonight. And we're going to explore this idea that doing science in hostile places is important, and it might be important as well as dangerous. And we want to talk a little bit about some of the topics that come up. It turns out that much of the world is hostile to researchers, and I don't just mean in a climatic sense, but in terms of war and social unrest and so on. And that means that there's a lot of the world that we're not collecting information in. At the same time, we want to ask ourselves, what right do we have to be in these places? It isn't just that it serves us to collect data there. We have to be able to do something for the local communities. And so we'll try to explore all of those ideas tonight. And at the end, we'll talk amongst ourselves and to you for about 35 minutes. And then there is time at the end for questions. So if you feel yourself having a question, write it down or remember it, and we'll come to you in the question time. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to spend about 60 seconds just introducing themselves and giving you an idea of what their particular role in this research in hostile environments is. But before that, let me just do a couple of housekeeping things. One is, please turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent mode. Or as my children, when they were still at school, one of the headmistresses said much more politely than I just said, just be sure to turn your phones back on when you leave the room tonight. The second thing is, we're not expecting any emergencies, but in case there's reason to evacuate this room. That's an emergency exit right there, and of course the door that you came in on. Okay, thank you all for that. Enough of an introduction. Let me start by asking our panelists just to say a few words about themselves and introduce themselves and tell us about their role in working in hostile places. Ella.
Hi, so thank you for coming. I'm a paleoanthropologist, I guess, by training. And I started thinking a lot about working in Yemen just because that's my ancestral homeland. And I guess the more I started working out there, the more I started thinking about hostile territories generally, because Yemen is, I guess, quite a hostile territory. It's what technically is called a red zone by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And then I started thinking about all the red zones and all the orange zones that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office talk about, and actually when I started looking at them on a map, I started thinking, hold on a second, we're actually not really doing as much science in these places as we do in other places, because it's actually quite hard to work in these places, partly because of grants, partly because of university conditions and expectations, and I guess I ended up accidentally specializing in that, and then it became quite on purpose. It became something that I thought about a lot. I started going into television, and a lot of what I do television-wise is hostile territories as well. And to relieve the stress of it, I do stand-up comedy, just because it can get a little bit weird sometimes, or just amusing. I think sometime last year I actually gave a TED talk on the subject, because it became acutely apparent to me how much of a problem we had as scientists, that we weren't doing this, and the kind of the impact on science, but also the impact on these places of us not doing any research or doing reduced research in these areas.
Leona.
Hi everyone, my name's Leona Vaughan. I am from the University of Liverpool. I'm a sociologist, so I'm a little bit out of my discipline in this panel. Although I work right across politics, international relations, psychology disciplines. My research up to now really has been concentrated around anti-slavery, or modern day slavery, as people might refer to it. in lots of different regions, and some regions which are experiencing current conflict and some regions which are in sort of post-conflict state. So my fellowship with the university is about anti-colonial methods and methodologies. So how do we inquire into this phenomena in a way that is not in a neo-colonial sense? And what I mean by that is that it's not an extractive process, that we don't just go as British academics, take the information, write all of the great articles and take all of the credit, that we actually develop, we collaborate, we co-develop our knowledge on the issues within those countries with researchers from those countries. So that's my way of working, and that's what my research is looking at now. So how do we best develop these methods and methodologies that are anti-colonial in that sense? And within that, I critically look at the idea of risk and risk as a concept, and how risk can be used to exclude particular types of research because it's seen as too risky, and because also institutions, not just universities but across the board, have become very risk averse. And in that, what we lose people's voices and experiences. So that's me. A piece of work which I think was the reason why I was invited onto the panel, which I've just recently done, was with the UK Collaborative on Development Research, and that was undertaking some international consultation on their safeguarding guidelines, which came about, as people may be aware, was part of the Department for International Development's response to the Haiti scandals. So I've been part of developing a new version of those principles and some guidance about questions that institutions, research partners and researchers should be asking themselves about safeguarding, particularly in hostile or post-conflict environments.
Brilliant, thank you. Graham.
I'm Graham Barker. I originally went to Cambridge as a student, did classics, then changed to archaeology. Then had jobs in Sheffield, Rome, Leicester, went back to Cambridge in 2004 as the Disney Professor of Archaeology and the Director of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research. These two bizarre, Disney and MacDonald, but not those Disneys and MacDonald. I've broadly worked on the relationships between environment and people, how people change environment, how environment changes people. That's kind of an overarching theme. It's involved me working on different periods of the past, from 150,000 years ago to working with present-day hunter-gatherers in Borneo. And it's involved me in terms of field work, field projects, in Italy, Libya, Jordan, Iraq, and Sarawak. And I suppose the reason I was asked is I ran a project in Libya from 2007 to 2013. Gaddafi was killed in 2011, so we were able to go back. We continued there until the American ambassador was killed in Benghazi. And then I've run a project in Iraqi Kurdistan, digging up a cave with Neanderthals in it from 2014 up to now. And that's how I got to know Ella, because she came out to work on the excavations and then came out also as part of a film she was making on Neanderthals. And I suppose the general point, though, is, I mean, archaeology, certainly field archaeology, is very much, it is a team subject. So the project I ran in Sarawak involved, in the end, 75 people involved in the publications. But there's been a group of 20 or 30 of us, archaeologists, geographers, zoologists, botanists, biologists, a group, and many of us have worked together ever since we were in our 20s in different projects. So I think one of the aspects for me, therefore, is doing projects where one's responsible for a group of people and making sure that it's safe. And Emma mentioned orange zones. So in the area of Libya that we worked, in the area of Iraqi Kurdistan we've worked, they've both been Foreign Office orange zones, meaning do not go unless your journey is absolutely essential, which now, of course, is Italy too has joined that ranks.
That's really good. Thank you. I think what we need to do is justify our existence here tonight. And we come in swashbuckling with this title, Science on the Front Line. So I'm going to ask Ella and I'm going to ask Graham. And Leona, I'll ask you a bit as well to do that for us. I mean, is it, we can challenge this. Is it really important to do science on the front line? What do we get on the front line that we don't get elsewhere? And have there actually been any discoveries that were made by working on the front line that wouldn't have been made had we worked in more docile places?
Well, I'm going to put a question to the professor at the end over there. The last Neanderthal full skeleton that was found anywhere in the world, I believe, was found by you lot.
Half a skeleton, the top half. So, yeah. I mean, yes, I mean, if you take, I mean, the big questions about the human past, I mean, one of the obvious ones is the whole question about human dispersals, what behaviors underpinned our transformation from an African species to a global species, and why are we all here, and we now know an increasing number of other species that were around at the same time, mostly, I mean, Neanderthals and others aren't. And so it's a research area which has been dominated by one or two areas, and that's the same actually within Africa. Our knowledge and understanding of human development in Africa has been dominated by work in a few areas, which aren't the difficult areas, meaning something like South Africa has dominated agendas in many ways. And another big question is, how did farming begin, the origins of agriculture later? And we know, for example, that, I mean, the cereal, sheep, goat range of agriculture, the native crops and animals that were domesticated probably went from the East Mediterranean to the Himalayas. But because of the politics of the world, most of our knowledge has come down to, when I was a student in the 60s, there was a certain amount of work going across on Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan and India. All of that has gone, really. So a huge amount of our understanding about big transformations come from countries which have been stable, like Israel. Tiny areas have been dominating big debates because of the inability or the problems of trying to do fieldwork in many of those parts of the world. And it's similar stories in Middle America to do with the same sort of research. If you think of through the 70s and 80s, all of the difficulties of the Contras and all the rest, all the horrible politics of Mesoamerica at different times, that again has been it's meant that our understanding of big transformations of life in the Americas has come down to a few areas which have been safe to work in.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose the idea that you're hearing tonight is that so much of the world is suffering from social unrest or war that we really have to get out there and study those bits of the world. And it isn't just digging up bones. I mean, I wanted to bring Leona in. I mean, Leona does a lot of work on modern slavery, and it's probably the case that these are in somewhat hostile territories as well.
Yeah.
Any comments on that?
Yeah, so for example, we look at also child soldiers and child soldiering as a form of modern slavery, because a lot of those children are abducted and trafficked into some sort of armed conflict. So we're doing some work with a project in Uganda. But I think rather than the question being, should we be there? I think that what we need to think about is, why are we there? Why there and not other places? But also, how are we doing this research? And I think that that's the key for me. So yes, it's absolutely essential. We've gathered so much information, so much of a better understanding of the phenomena of child soldiers within Uganda, but we've also learned a lot through working locally with, so we work with a peer support group of ex-child soldiers, and they're our peer researchers, so they're doing the research, sort of, on the ground, interviewing people who have returned to communities who have been child soldiers. And we're gaining a different type of knowledge and understanding, which I think we wouldn't get if Leona from Liverpool travelled to Uganda, working through an interpreter, tried to do these interviews. So I think that some of the key questions for me is about who the research is benefiting. If the only benefit, sometimes I think in academia the pursuit of knowledge that is a unique contribution. Sometimes we don't stop and think about, well, whose knowledge is this? How are we going to develop this knowledge? Who's this knowledge going to benefit? How do we use it going forwards for public good? Because that's what universities are there for. We're there as charitable institutions to do public good. So I think that, those questions are absolutely essential, and none more so than when you're working in post-conflict areas, because the last thing we want to do, so for example in Uganda, these are peer researchers. They're not turning up in not armoured vehicles, but you do need a particular type of vehicle to access these terrains of Uganda. So, if you're an ex-child soldier trying to come back into that community, a British researcher turns up in a fancy car at your home, straight away, the local community know, hang on a minute, why has this researcher come to see you? And that can then expose them to stigma, isolation, even violence within those communities. So these are the types of things that we need to think about. We don't want to exacerbate situations. So whilst it's important to understand it, and it helps us because it's transferable, we can understand then bigger sociological problems. But what we don't want to do is be part of unintentionally exacerbating the situation.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? So I guess for me, bluntly, it's a bit like somebody's given you a jigsaw, but they've taken a whole pile of pieces of the jigsaw out, and those pieces all represent unstable territories, and they tell us what the picture is. And I think in a lot of fields like paleoanthropology especially, that's the situation you're looking at if you are not going into all of the territories, all of the places. And Graham's completely right. If we think about Africa and the history of paleoanthropology, where are we mostly? Okay, we're in East Africa, specifically Kenya, because of the leakies, right? Because of a colonial history. And we're in South Africa because it was deemed safer, and also because of various colonial issues. Those are the issues. Those are the places that we were in. I'm about to go out to Somaliland. We've had no paleoanthropologists in Somaliland, in the whole of Somalia. And that's partly an accident of history. So you've got to ask yourself, what fossils are we not finding because we're just not in those places? And I think it is worth pointing out that some incredible discoveries. I mean, Graham has completely undersold, being very, very humble. The last, it's been a few years since a Neanderthal fossil has been found. His team, how many?
25, 30 years.
Right, there we go.
This is a cave that was this is the one we're digging called Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Yeah. And just kind of on that, I just finished filming something for Channel 4 in Colombia, and we were in FARC territory, and we were there because just a few months ago, a group of archaeologists have just found what we are thinking is potentially, this hasn't really been announced, so actually I probably shouldn't say it, but because I've just realised this is being streamed as well. But a very, very big discovery. And yeah, sorry, thinking on my feet. Yeah. Watch it, guys. It should be out in a few months. Anyway, but a really, really huge discovery, and they only did that because FARC territory was started to open out enough so that this team could go in, and it's still not a friendly zone, but it's no longer the kind of the risky zone it was. And I guess truthfully, I would say that for everything and every field of our lives, we have a risk line, right? So your university might have a risk line, and you might find that when you go to a different university, the risk line is different, right? I have risk lines in all kinds of things. Some people, for example, their risk line means that they should not be on a bike in central London. Today, that should have been my risk line because I got on the bike and I was like, what am I thinking? I haven't been on my bike in a few months because I've been away. But the truth is, every one of us has a risk line. And I think with the sciences and with research, there's this arbitrary risk line that has just been put forward, and it's become more and more and more risk averse. So this line has shifted more and more and more this way. And we're not explicitly talking about this risk line and why we've put it there. So for example, we're we're comfortable, for example, sending people into deep caves. Let me tell you, the most terrified I ever am is when I'm in some of those really, really deep Yorkshire caves because they're vertical and they're terrifying. I'm more terrified there. The most scary situation I've ever been in was with a snake. And I think we're so comfortable with certain risks, yet we're actually, as universities, as institutions, as grant awarding bodies, we haven't explicitly talked about the risk line that is red zones and orange zones. And I guess the final thing I'll say, just because you kind of reminded me, sorry, is about the child soldier thing. It sparked a memory, which is actually that in my field, if you get archaeologists going into a place, you run one risk, right, which is people think that there's gold there and they start digging up and they might ruin the thing. But actually, if we explain things really well, there is another thing that tends to happen, which is the younger people, the younger generations start looking up and going, hold on a second, there's a hell of a lot of foreigners coming here once or twice a year. What's going on? What's so special about this place? Is there something special about my heritage? Might I grow up and not be a child soldier in the worst case and instead be an archaeologist? Might there be a future there? And I'm not saying there is, but that's something really exciting to explore.
Which actually, that follows on, and I think if you're in archaeology, the past is highly contested. The past is very rarely neutral. And one of the aspects of working in these areas, yes, there is the scientific potential we've talked about, but conflict areas very commonly, I mean, there is conflict over natural resources, but very, very commonly there is conflict over people's different sense of identities, of similarities and differences to each other, whether it's Hutus, Tutsis, or the different populations in Belfast. I mean, you've clearly got, it's rooted in a past, whether it's focalized or not. And therefore, there is an aspect of why one does archaeology in these countries. Working in Libya, I mean, people would come to visit the cave we were digging, and they knew nothing of it. It's the largest, it's the largest humanly occupied cave in North Africa, and it's one of the most famous archaeologically. It was no part of school textbooks in Gaddafi's world. The Roman archaeology, wonderful archaeology, was no part of that because it was seen as some kind of colonial version of what was then to be the Italian occupation much later. So, and Libya, as we're now seeing, is reverting back into this West and East two countries and so on. So the role of trying to get a more balanced understanding of a past, contributing to that, which actually comes to what Ella was saying, is nowhere more important than in the Syrias of the world, than in the Iraqs of the world and the Libyas of the world. Iraq, it's clear you just have to think of the Kurdish, the politics of the Kurds in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and clearly all of that is based on senses of similarities and differences, which is all rooted in the past, which is why we're working there on this famous site. And I did another, not a red zone, but the project we did in Sarawak, we were working with hunter-gatherers and rice farmers up in the mountains of Borneo, where their land is being logged, and the only way they can protect their land from being logged is demonstrating what are called customary native rights, which means they've been there. So both these groups of people were looking to us, it was a group of archaeologists, palynologists, anthropologists, to what kind of past we would create. And it's never easy, because in fact the hunter-gatherers wanted us to come up with one kind of past to show they'd been there forever, and the rice farmers wanted another kind of past. So it's never simply a question of, if you like, the local people versus the wider authorities. It was very, very typical. You had these logging threats of big forces, and the archaeologists were very much trying to create to help towards that sort of realization of
Graham, could I come in there? Because this is raising all sorts of really interesting points, and Ella was alluding to some of them. That do we have a real responsibility when we go into these areas, not to create instability? Do we also have a responsibility in realizing that it's easy for us to say that we're providing training when we go in and so on and so forth, but when we leave, doesn't it just all revert back? In other words, we can leave these places, they can't. And so how do we deal with those issues? What do we really think we're doing in these areas, if not just taking the information they have to offer?
Yes, and building careers out of other people's heritage, yeah. I mean, the Libyan project, we had a group, I mean, the Libyan Department of Antiquities really worked under a system of malign neglect under Gaddafi. Gaddafi was from 1969. And you know, in a world of incredibly difficult government context, they kept going and kept going. I mean, many of us have known these Libyan colleagues for years and years. And a group from the Antiquities Departments of Cyrenaica worked with us on this cave. We were there until 2013, as I said, when this American ambassador was killed. We just got down to the most important part of this 14-metre deep trench that we dug. We re-excavated a trench dug in the 1950s. We just got down to the absolutely critical earliest material, 150,000 years old, when we had to stop. And these colleagues organised to finish it for us. And they tried first, and they had to be warned off by the army, because just to the east of us is Derna, which was an ISIS town, and the government were attacking it. And I remember the Libyan guy in charge of it phoning me up, and you could hear the sound of airstrikes in the background saying, we have been told, you know, we've got to stop digging here. And then they managed to go back another 6 months later and completed it with the highest standards, both excavation and all the processing afterwards, and the material was got eventually out for study. So that's an example where actually people often in incredibly difficult circumstances. Now, I happen to be in a subject, as I said, where often they're the lowest of the pile. The archaeology departments very frequently, they come under tourism. The big departments more powerful.
There, Graham? I mean, isn't the lowest of the pile the people on the ground?
No, I mean in the structural sense.
Maybe Leona can talk to us about this a little bit. I mean, should part of our training be that we leave something concrete when we do pull our grants out? I mean, we get our grants from our governments, our rich governments, or the European Union. That's going to come to an end, perhaps. And we go to these places and we stay there 5, 10, 15 years. But when we leave, what happens? And you must. This is a large part of what you do, Leanne. Should we be building in somehow engagement with the local community?
So, in the field, in terms of the work that I've done in the field with the anti-slavery projects that we are working with in West Africa and East Africa, you know, we have, you know, sort of made a conscious effort to network those projects. And these are grassroots projects, like I say, you know, ex-child soldiers in Uganda, working with anti-slavery campaigners within Mali and Niger. You know, these are people who are working on the ground, dealing with these issues, what I'd call activist researchers. And part of the legacy of the work that we're doing is to actually build a network for them, so that within the African countries, there are a network of people who are doing this work, that they can then start to develop their ideas, they can start to write things together, you know, because we need to be always conscious, I think, that research, no matter how neutral we try and present it, it is always a political act. It is a political act in terms of whose stories get told, who gets to tell them, who gets researched, and who gets paid. You know, this is a big issue. You know, quite often you'll find, and this came out within our consultation with different research partners and research institutions and what we'd call gatekeeper organisations, so quite often NGOs, international NGOs, civil society organisations, even right down to faith-based organisations, community grassroots organisations, that they'd say, well, you know, we're doing the work usually for these academic teams, but we get paid a significant amount of money less than what you'd pay a British researcher who you send over, who doesn't speak the language, who doesn't know the customs, who doesn't understand the traditions, doesn't understand the history, you know, in the way that we're discussing it as well. You know, so it's like the political environments. How is that fair? So, you know, we consciously took an approach where, actually, no. So the international consultation for UK CDR, we worked with people on the ground, and they got paid exactly the same as we did. You know, and that might not seem like a revolutionary act, but actually that was a statement to those partners that totally redressed the power imbalance that we see.
Can I bring Ella in here on that point? I mean, because does that have an unintended consequence, though, which is that to pay someone in one of those areas the same as you'd pay someone in the UK enormously destabilizes the local economy?
Yeah.
Is it, in your experience in Somaliland, it must be...
So,
yeah.
This is such a complicated, long discussion, and I think there's a lot of nuance there, and there's really famous cases of one of the earthquakes, where was it? I can't remember, where a bunch of international NGOs went in and just completely inflated all the prices because they had no idea what the local prices for certain things were, and it kind of caused problems there. I guess I was just kind of wanted to say three things on this. One is, I think let's not undersell the importance of training local people in these specialisms. So paleoanthropology, that specialism, doesn't exist in large portions of our planet. It just doesn't exist. And actually, a lot of specialisms are like that, you know, from biodiversity, certain biodiversity specialisms, all the way through to certain genetic specialisms, all the way through to archaeology. Certain specialisms don't exist in some parts of the world. And often, unstable territories that's very much a problem. I can think of two examples. So in the Nagorno-Karabakh, which I very briefly kind of worked in, a team had historically worked there a few decades back, and then they all kind of upped and left. And the thing is, because they trained no actual locals from the area, it means that when another team came in very recently in the last few years, they were really stuck because they had nobody in the local area that knew anything about the caves. They were like, oh, these foreign people came in, some other people from some other random place, and there was no continuity of knowledge, which was really, really problematic because this was these people's local village and they had no knowledge of what was going on in the cave there. In Yemen, the field of paleoanthropology doesn't exist. The same thing in Somaliland. The nearest thing you can find is sometimes something called prehistory. In Yemen, there's two people that specialize in prehistory. That's it. And prehistory, imagine, paleoanthropology is deep, deep time. Prehistory is very broad. And there's no quaternary geologists. Now, when I'm in the field, I kind of need a quaternary geologist. I need somebody who can tell me some of the things that I'm looking at in terms of stratigraphy and certain things. And I couldn't find a quaternary geologist in the whole of Yemen because most people are geared up to the petrol industry. Eventually, I found a quaternary geologist. I work in caves. The guy was terrified of working in caves. I was like, this is insane. But if you can actually train people up, there's a whole bunch of master's students in all of these countries who are desperate to collaborate, who are desperate for research projects. And yes, you might need to spend a bit more time on certain things, but actually, if you can actually create a specialization in these places, isn't that part of why we're doing it? Isn't that for the betterment of science? And I guess one of the things I'm looking at right now in Africa, I've just kind of received a grant, is to actually look at models of how to work in unstable territories that is realistic, but also builds local specialization. And how on earth we do that? You know, are we using WhatsApp groups? Are we genuinely? How do you map caves in unstable places? Just even identify where these caves are, because of course most caves on the planet, I would argue, are not known to science. And then I think the final thing I'll say is some of these ethical points and ethical points of consideration aren't actually just ethical points of consideration for people working in hostile territories. They're ethical points of consideration for anybody working in what we'd call the developing world or the global south. I cannot tell you how many times I am banging my head against a brick wall going, what you guys are talking about is so unethical and it's so colonial and I'm about to lose it. I've had people talk to me about all kinds of things. We are behaving in a way in some parts of the world which we would never be able to get away with in Europe. I've seen archaeological teams claim exclusivity on a whole country, right? Don't get me wrong, one archaeological team should be exclusive on a dig because you don't want different archaeological teams digging the same spot. But imagine a team that's only really in a country for about 3 or 4 weeks a year having an exclusive, a monopoly in writing for a whole country. These things are insane. They're completely unethical. I've had people say to me, well, there's already loads of research that's been done on this place. What else are you lot going to contribute? And I just thought, wow, in Wales, how many specialists do you have in every single one of these fields? You find one plot of land in the global south, and you know that for the rest of your career, you are made because you can just keep publishing. And therefore, you are actively trying to discourage other people from coming in. I was at the point where I was like, oh, right, so everything's been discovered and we've repeated all the experiments, we've done everything. Great, so I'll pack my bags up. Maybe I should help you pack up your bags as well, seeing as we've discovered everything, we've done all the research. And I think there's real, I think some of the things are not exclusive to the hostile territories, but they are accentuated in some of those places just because people think they can get away with it, and it helps people's careers. It makes people's careers, having an exclusive on a piece of the planet.
Well, I think we have to wrap up fairly quickly, but there's a third topic I want to touch on. I think Leona can wrap it up for us, which is that we've heard a little bit about the importance of going to these hostile places from a purely scientific point of view. We've heard some really nuanced stuff about the effect we have on the ground when we go to these places. And these are really experienced people talking to you, so they know how to discuss this, and they know the effect they have. But that leaves open this sort of third topic, which is, should our training for PhD students, postdoctoral students, and so on, should it be broadened to include a whole lot more than you just need these jabs to go there and be sure to get your ethical clearance? What more should we do?
Yeah, I think that it really speaks to a change of culture for research institutions, particularly for universities, because we do have a very sort of truncated process for researchers. They will put their application together to the university for ethical approval to undertake some research, which is based on what they know about the country, which may be quite little. And then when that approval comes through, they go off into whichever country that they're going to be looking at. And yes, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office advice will be followed, but as we've already heard, that is not given the full picture. That won't tell them the political context, how, understanding the more subtle issues that they would need to be aware of if they're undertaking research in these particular communities or particular regions or areas, and how that might affect them in the field. So I think that the time has certainly arrived for universities to catch up on issues around thinking more broadly. This is not an issue of ethics. We do not make an application, tick a box, and off they go. It's a constant conversation, and it has to be a constant conversation with people around safety. Is this ethical in our approach? Are there any unintended consequences that we need to really, really keep thinking about? And I think that is where university training, curriculum content needs to change, because we're not taught to do that sort of thing. We learn the methods, we learn our subject, but we don't necessarily learn, how to consider whether paying someone in cash makes them more vulnerable to then being attacked within that community, or turning up with, a particular vehicle is spotlighting this person in terms of their vulnerability. We don't learn those things. Those things come from experience. And I think that's where, as supervisors, as lecturers, we need to sort of really speak up that part of research. Things have tended to be felt like to be implicit, but actually universities are now at that moment where they have to make things explicit. They have to. It has to be a process. It has to be transparent. I'm very anti-tick box approaches because of all the reasons that I've already said. And I think that once an area or a country is deemed to be too risky, then we lose the opportunity to really understand the lived experiences or the histories of those places. And that's where the conversation has to be with the country, with the people in the country, with our in-country partners, with the NGOs, with the journalists, with the people who know the place on the ground, as well as the academic institutions. We can't assume that we know what to do when we get to these countries, and we can't assume that researchers, especially very junior researchers, will know that as well.
So, Ella, earlier this evening you were telling us you went on a course where you had to be taught how to be kidnapped.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun. Yeah, so I guess, so I've always, that's pretty much what I've done, gone into these places that are really unstable. And I've done it because I'm a scientist, and because I'm an adventurer. That's kind of, because I'm also a TV presenter, I guess everyone had just assumed that I had the relevant training. And then recently they found out that I didn't, and they were like, oh, this is terrible, you need to hurry up and go on it. So I just got sent on this 4-day course. And if you work in the media, if you work in TV, in the UK, you can't get approval to go into half these places unless you have one of these high-risk trainings under your belt. And they're brilliant. They happen in Kent. And it's very, very strange because people going past in Land Rovers and you're wearing a massive bulletproof thing, ducking and covering from everything because they run through all these simulations. But actually the most important thing that they do is first aid training, emergency first aid training. And one of the most important components of that is road traffic accidents. Because actually, truthfully, look, I've walked past landmines, and I have thought about tribal kidnappings and ISIS and bloody Somali pirates and everything. But actually, truthfully, we're more likely to get killed from things that we probably get killed from in the UK, but we don't have the medical access. And so for me, I'm always slightly concerned because I don't want people to think that I'm basically issuing a gung-ho call that we should all kind of go into, a place that's being actively bombed. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we should be nuanced, and we should be clearer, and we should be better trained, and our institutions shouldn't just be banning us from going into places which the FCO have deemed red or orange zones. There should be more of a discussion about it.
People often sort of assume, they used to make jokes about me, where's he going to work next because there's going to be a civil war there and so on. Was he going to work in Kent or I don't know, because of Libya and then Iraq. Actually, if you're in charge of 15, 20 people, whatever, you're incredibly cautious. And the places I've worked, I mean, we have huge risk assessments, and my main clearly, there's a huge amount of effort goes into making sure that it all happens as safely as possible, and that we're embedded in the local societies and so on and so forth. We were in Iraq when ISIS attacked, when they threatened. They were within half an hour of Erbil, and the University of Cambridge then said we had to come out. So we were sort of extracted. I mean, put on a plane on a huge empty plane with about 15 oil workers and taken out. And shortly after that, the university sent a note round to all departments, and it said working in Foreign Office orange zones. And it said the university is happy to insure teams, because obviously we go. It's a team from all over the world, but it's a Cambridge University insurance. Anyway, the university is happy to insure individuals and teams working in orange zones, as long as there's appropriate risk assessments been signed up through the various channels. But they said there are two aspects they wanted to bring in. One is they said people doing this work should take enough cash to buy themselves out, like buy emergency tickets for air. So in the case of Iraq, 12 people have a spare $12,000 in your pocket in case you had to buy fares. So number one was take lots of cash. And number two, it said, but if you have to use it, we won't reimburse you. It's external. In fact, I have been hugely impressed by the risk assessment. It's true that one despairs at one end of students having to fill in risk assessments to, get their bicycle to Cambridge Station and go to the British Museum to visit something. But on the other hand, there is a huge amount of work we do try to provide on particularly the lone PhD students, about where they're going to work, how they're going to work, and the embedding and all the rest of it. So I've been enormously impressed. The university has a specialist advisors who will have up-to-date briefings. I have to do a huge risk assessment, then that gets looked at by them, then it comes back to me. I have to then show how I've responded to things that this external company, and they'll be saying 3 days ago, 20 miles from the cave we're digging, X happened. So it's incredibly up to date, and then I have to respond to what I'm going to do. Then they respond. So and again, they have to approve it, And it's only at that stage when my final response to this external review, and they're satisfied, it then gets signed off by the individual department person, and only at that stage is the insurance valid. So it's a complex procedure, and that's for the larger team, but actually for the individual PhD students, I mean, every effort is made to make sure that they really are, in the broadest sense, that they really are aware of what they're going into and building up relationships. And mostly it comes down to building up relationships over time, not just going to launch in.
And I think that there's a tradition within universities to consider all international research to be more risky. But I think, like Ella sort of referred to, we really need to be thinking about all of our research and safety in all environments. Why is it less risky to interview ex-prisoners in Merseyside than to, going on an archaeological dig in Greece? So we really need to think about how we talk about and how we approach issues around potential for risk. Look, we cannot get to a situation where we can go, yeah, we've eliminated all risks. Just doesn't happen. But what we need to demonstrate and what we need to get used to doing is thinking through, anticipating, doing as much as we can to mitigate any potential risks, and making sure that when risks actually happen, that we act upon them, and that institutionally we learn from it. And I think that cycle of experience, sometimes things will go wrong. What do we learn? How do we change things? That cycle really needs to be a continuous thing within universities. We really need to be having that conversation a lot more than we do. It shouldn't just be about individual researchers.
And I will say, just kind of not a disclaimer, but just as a footnote, I guess, on the truly, truly riskiest expeditions that I do, I'm about to swear, forgive me. Am I allowed to swear? There's a few younger people in the room, I won't. I basically say, I don't need that on me. And what that means is when I interview people, I am basically making sure that person is not nervous, particularly about going to the place that we're going to. Is not nervous about the mode of transportation and understands the risks involved. If I have to in any way convince anyone to come with me on one of our really dangerous expeditions, they're not coming with me. They're literally not coming with me, because I don't need somebody, if something goes wrong, I don't want somebody who I'm then going to have intense guilt over, and I'm kind of going to be worrying about them. We've all had this with team members who somebody just, it's not quite working for them. I want somebody who is fully open and aware of what's happening and the risks involved, and is willing to take them. Their risk line is somewhere else, and that's what I'm looking for. And that's absolutely okay, because if I'm talking to somebody and their gut feeling is something else, why on earth would I push them into something risky? That's not the kind of environment that I want at all. So I will just say that as a disclaimer. It's not about pushing people into doing things. It's about people that already want to do something, that are already fascinated in a topic and are already comfortable with that risk. The kind of people who are nuts and want to climb Everest. Do you know what I mean? Why are we stopping them, I guess?
I'd say coming back, it's probably wrong to say, but this Iraq project, this excavation, because my God, what it must be like, the security working there. Well, actually, there are over 40 teams been working, international teams in Iraqi Kurdistan, all the way through, before and during and after ISIS. And the particular excavation is an absolute pig, technically. It's an absolute pig in terms of the access to the site. The logistics are incredibly complicated. The living is incredibly complicated. My partner got bitten by a mouse and stung by two scorpions in the house we were living in, and we crammed in, and the relationships with the locals are totally straightforward. The relationship with the Antiquities Department is always quite complicated. It's quite a difficult context for what their concerns. And actually, the last thing I ever think of, having done all the security stuff first, is security. I mean, it's set up that it works. And we happen to be in an area that's got Peshmerga soldiers guard the site that we're working on, and there are roadblocks with the Peshmerga soldiers where we are. So I always think actually it's probably one of the most secure places we could ever be to work in at the end.
I think we have to stop there and open it up for questions. That you thought living in the time of coronavirus was risky. You should try working with one of these three. Should we take some questions, Amy? gentleman there. Anybody else? We'll go to this lady in the front after the gentleman.
Apparently we can't pass the microphone around.
We're going to just hold the microphone so everyone's just speaking.
Yeah.
Hi. Well, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you've been in a situation, or just generally your thoughts on if you're in a place where you think, with regard to artifacts, if you think that you're in a place where that artifact might be damaged over the long term, is it ethical to move that, for example, to this country or another country?
Ooh, who'd like to take that?
Artifact material. I mean, archaeology is a very, very different subject from all the others. You're quite right. I mean, you know, the heritage belongs to the country you're working in. I mean, it might also be, you know, world importance, but in a legal sense, it's theirs. And so, I mean, the material from these Neanderthal excavations, I mean, the Neanderthal that we found in pieces is here in Cambridge, being worked on. There's absolutely no question but that it belongs to the host country, and when it's duly studied, restored, whatever, that's where it will be. I mean, so there are sometimes ethical questions, I suppose, about, you know, is a site being destroyed anyway for whatever reasons, therefore should work take place? Or rather, you know, work should take place because it is going to be destroyed anyway. But I don't think, for us in a way, it's not an issue. I mean, the materials, certain materials stay in the country, and this is talking now about Iraq. And the other materials come out, and some of them come out on a kind of long-term loan, some of them come out on a year, they have to go back after that. And so there's quite a formalised procedure, but it's never really been an issue, really, in the sense that the rules are clear on both sides.
I would say it's a bloody dangerous thing to start taking antiquities out of a country. I think I was in a situation where I had to think about this really seriously, and my solution to it was to take a scanner in and make sure that was part of our protocols. If we found what we hoped we were going to find, we would scan it in case it got lost. I've heard of when ISIS, for example, went into some places, people were hiding them within country. And I think that is actually the safest way of doing this kind of thing. You know, there are people already that care so much about their antiquities, and it's about in situations where ISIS was moving in, people were learning how to hide them, which prominent families, for example, could hide stuff. Something similar happened in Timbuktu. You're not looking to, as Westerners, I think if we're going in and any part of our protocols are, we will remove this if no. You know, think of something else, think of another option is my...
In the case of the Gaddafi, at the time of the original Gaddafi fighting, local people actually welded up the museum doors to stop antiquities being taken, and local people prevented the grounds of some of the famous archaeological sites being used for military and so on. So actually there was a huge amount of local concern and bottom-up defence of their heritage to stop it being a victim of the war. It survived. The only thing that was damaged in the National Museum was the VW Beetle that had been Gaddafi's. That's the only thing. Everything else was there.
You're allowed to remove those.
Yeah.
I think this lady had a question here.
It was kind of about the data when you kind of talked about at the beginning, and apologies if you kind of already answered this, but since we're not getting the data from these places or as much as we'd like, due to them being orange or red zones or what have you, is it akin to the way that male subjects were more studied over female subjects, and white was more studied than other races in like medical or what have you? And might that skew the results? And can that be rectified in the future? I'm probably answering my own question, but...
Leona, do you want to take that one?
Did you want to...
No, I was just going to say, in some fields, it's simply you're looking at complete bias. In paleoanthropology, it's complete bias. Like the leaky thing is a perfect example. There's no way, I'm sure, that most of us believe that, you know, there's just more fossils in Kenya, specifically Kenya in South Africa, than come on, it's you know,
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much I can add to that, really. I think there is always a bias. when we collect data in terms of, there will always be, did one group's story get told more than others? And this is something that, we've certainly come across working on, particularly around child labour within the Ghanaian communities. So we looked at particular regions, and so it's like, well, why are you studying that region, not our region? So, it's like, because also I think as well, depending on what context you're working within, that people think that there is some additional benefit that people get from being involved in research as well. So there is this idea that, sort of one group or community has benefited more than others. But yeah, you always have to consider then, sort of the story that you're telling, is it complete? I think that you can only, just be aware of, that you're telling part of the story and acknowledge that, and that the data that you've got has some integrity, and that's what your, that's what your research is based on. I don't know, does that answer the question?
In the case of archaeology, I suppose, there's a huge amount of consciousness of the post-colonial world we're in, and a lot of universities are rewriting their curricula to try and, in a kind of recognition that in many respects they are colonial products, some aspects. But that's also part of a much wider concern to try and get at the multivocality of the past, the voices of children, the voices of males, females, and so on and so forth. So just the realization that it isn't just a particular kind of past. There's broadly, theoretically, across certainly the archaeology, the archaeology worlds that we're in, there's much more consciousness of this creation of stories, and trying to be conscious of the different voices from the past you're trying to get at.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes commenting on the absence or the ellipsis of particular voices within the research is a powerful enough observation to say, actually, we know that there is more to this story. There is a reason why women's voices are not in the stories of slave descendants. There is a reason why, so there is a lot to be said about just observing the gaps.
Well, and sometimes you can only be aware of that in retrospect, I would think. Retrospectively looking at the data and saying, these were the only people that were studied.
Yeah,
But you can be proactive around that in terms of,
certainly, clearly, archaeology, like all these sciences, the questions we pose about the past result in us applying certain methodologies and collecting certain sorts of data. There isn't such a thing as completely objective, bland collection, and I'm as conscious of that with some of the earlier projects where now the questions would change. And a lot of the projects I've run, they kind of develop organically, whereas my job is to sort of keep an overall intellectual focus. But you bring new people in, new PhD students, different questions come out. But inevitably, there are projects where you just, now if we were doing them again, we would be asking other sorts of questions, and the methods would have changed.
Yeah.
Also, depending on the area, so for example, now my teams often have a biodiversity component to them. And if you're looking to find new species, you want to be going to politically unstable places, because the chances that you'll find new species out there, and new species are very sexy, they're something that's very easy to publish, they kind of, they get a lot of attention. That's, go to those unstable places, because that's where there's very few people looking, so.
But then there's the balance of not feeling like you're exploiting the
thank
political
you.
stability to gather great data and sexy articles.
And in terms of export, working
and
in
permits
Sarawak,
and everything, yes.
the permit in Sarawak, there's a huge concern, obviously, about people taking away aspects of plants that become drugs. So we had an enormous effort to get clearance for taking out some bugs from the cave that we excavated in Borneo. In the same way, Iraq is very common in having antiquities legislation that was set up in the 1920s to stop people taking columns and gold coins away, and it applies to every bag of soil that we want to take out, and we just have to work in a system like that.
Question here, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, thank you for going to those geographies and to listening to voices where we've got little knowledge, so thank you for that. My question to you is what geographies or what voices have you wanted to research but have been turned down?
Ella, tell us about places you've been turned down.
Turned down by.
Nothing. You've never been turned down.
The main thing I would add, where we would like to go, is the cave we're digging in Iraqi Kurdistan, was excavated between 1951 and 1960, and about 10 Neanderthals were found, and most of them were in Baghdad. And one of them is in the Smithsonian in Washington, and half of one is now in Cambridge, the new one we found. And we and the paleoanthropologists in the project, well, I and the paleoanthropologists project, are incredibly keen to go to Baghdad to look at the material in the National Museum, both the bones and the other artifacts. And the National Museum is very keen that we come. The university is
Less keen.
and again, in terms of putting people at risk and the story, and we're operating systems. We haven't got any of those sorts of budgets to buy, security people at £10,000 a day, all that sort of stuff. It's just got to be when it's safe enough to go. Again, embedded, knowing people in Baghdad, friends, and do it. But that's the one thing that for me hasn't been possible to do so far. And we're very, very conscious and waiting. Each time we think it's getting a little easier to think that we can go to Baghdad, things happen that it goes back.
Graham, do you think there is a way in which you could maybe medical doctors or local anatomists or even local archaeologists, if they're given the right way of documenting something, whether it's a scanner or whatever, is there a halfway house?
No. I mean, the paleoanthropologist is Emma Pomeroy working with it, and we've talked about that. In this particular thing, she doesn't think it's feasible because the particular kinds of, their bones have been quite well studied already. So it's really trying to look in different sorts of ways at surface. Is there evidence for how Neanderthals treated their dead and so on? And
it's a high level of specialisation.
It's very specialised, and even if they had CT scanner, and it's difficult. But we have to say that the Libyan example is where things were done by people who worked well with us and did them brilliantly.
I've got a couple of examples, not where it's been an outright no, but where it's been a very long conversation. A quick one is we work closely with a community project in a place called Doncassira in Mali, which is currently experiencing some ethnic conflict. Now, whilst the project that is there and running is still, sort of working and the local researchers are working on it, I actually couldn't get permission to go to the country because of the conflict in the areas. And that, sort of feels a little like you've left the field workers to just, sort of find their own way and left to their own devices. So that was a really...
Permission from?
From the university to travel. So the Foreign Commonwealth Office was... don't go. We were on red for that country. So we had to find a way around that, and we brought that project to a meeting in Ghana, which was, the internal travel was much easier. But that, sort of was very frustrating because you don't really get a sense of the work that is happening. So that's just a quick one. The one that was much more complicated was research I was doing on child labour, particularly in Bangladesh. So I was interested in children working within the garment industry. The partners that we worked with in Bangladesh were union organisers, really incredible, feisty, articulate women who really, really understood the issues that were happening. But when I put my ethics application to the university about interviewing children, we'd been funded to do a project on child labour. They didn't want us to speak to anyone under the age of 15 without parental consent. Now this, for people who are working in universities, I'm sure that this is not an unusual experience, something that you can probably all identify with. But particularly for Bangladesh, where children were getting married at 10 and 11, that would very likely, by the age of 15, have children of their own. It just seemed like such an arbitrary line, sort of like, no, after 15, that's fine. Under 15, no, we need parental consent. And that, that we had to have this conversation backwards and forwards about the additional risk that then posed if a young, 13-year-old who is married has to then go and ask her husband for permission to be involved in research. What additional risks does that expose her to, especially when she has to work to pay, for the family. So there was no real sort of contextualisation of these risk lines, as Ella will talk about, for particular contexts and countries. So frustrating long conversations where you have to, justify the reason why you're doing this research in this way.
I guess the Yemeni mainland at one point got too dangerous for us to go into. It was just really, really too dangerous. And at one point I was thinking I could risk it, but I couldn't ask the local team because I knew what their families were going through. So I guess that's probably the main example.
There's a question here, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Maybe you already answered to some of my question, but based on your experience, usually with who do you have the most issues? I mean, is it usually more local people or authorities to get the acceptability? And if it is authorities, is it more national level, regional level, or local level?
So this is get what, sorry?
Yes, I think the question is really who is it that you're dealing with to get these permissions?
Where's the biggest headache coming from?
Yeah, and is it
more
national?
local issues with local people, or is it more authorities issues for acceptability?
Hugely variable. I co-directed a project for UNESCO years ago in Libya where Gaddafi wanted to know how the edge of the desert was farmed in the Roman period. And there was a project in the west that I was the co-director of, British Anglo-Libyan, and a French-Libyan one in the centre of Libya, and an Italian-Libyan one in the east. And that couldn't get going because of the politics with Egypt, the difficulty there. The French one was stopped after a year by the local People's Committee at a grassroots level because they didn't like what they were doing. They didn't think they were doing what they should have been doing, which they were actually quite right. In terms of overall, I mean, what we're often doing, in archaeology, you're in a very different legal structure. You're always dealing with permits from a department in a very formalized sort of structure at a national level. In the case of Iraq, actually, it's this semi-autonomous region of Kurdistan. But then there's the local issues of goodwill and acceptance of what you're doing and rates of payment of people and all the rest of it. So that's actually just making sure that it all works well and you build up relationships over the years where you're seen as a benefit to the process. But the formal permit is always at national level in all these countries, as it here is in Britain.
I think for me this speaks to nuance and research. So I always say that working in unstable territories is one of the biggest headaches is the amount of research that you have to put into it. And every single region for me is different. And when I look at a region, I look at all the threats, as well as who's going to be difficult, who I need permissions from, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these places are disputed. So some of them, under international law, good luck to you. There was one point where I thought I might have to get a lawyer involved just because I couldn't work out technically where I fell under. But with every single region, and sometimes it's actually quite interesting. So for example, I worked in Northern Cyprus. We had a massive issue because we were scared. Actually, we weren't scared. All the locals were scared. We were about to break UN regulations by just breaking soil because it's a contested area. The biggest issues there turned out to be landmines and just general bureaucracy because everybody was absolutely terrified that we would find dead bodies and that would, mean something about the civil war, right? We did actually find some landmines, and the UN were absolutely hilarious in the way they wanted to deal with it. They were like, well, if you tell us where your landmines are, we'll tell you where the other landmines are. And we're like, this is an exchange program. It's bloody landmines. Tell us where they are because we don't want to die. When I was working in the mainland of Yemen, the permissions were really easy. They were desperate for me to work there because I'm of Yemeni heritage. The issue there was working out which tribes were going to be potentially kidnapping us, which of them have close relationships with ISIS. Well, it wasn't ISIS, it was Al-Qaeda, sorry. And it was thinking about some of those issues. In Socotra, which is the island off Yemen, which I work in, it was thinking about how on earth we were going to get there. And in the end, we ended up taking a cement cargo ship. And with that, you're thinking about the fact that the cement cargo ship isn't fit for purpose. You're thinking about the fact that there's Somali pirates in the area. It's working out where all of that's happening. And so every single region is different. Somaliland technically isn't a state under international law. It's technically Somalia, but if we go down that route, it's going to be a headache actually getting any work done on the ground. I've had to read up on Al-Shabaab because, you know, that's the threat that's in the area. And so I think some people think that because I do unstable territories that I'm some kind of an adrenaline junkie, and I have to read extensively. I end up becoming essentially a journalist by accident on the region just so that I know what the threats are and who I'm supposed to be talking to. And, you know, not messing up. Sometimes if you speak to the wrong person with the wrong surname, you've created an issue. Sometimes you take a fixer with you. Your driver is the wrong tribe. And unless you know all this stuff, and you will mess up, I have. But it's actually really, really interesting just how much you have to understand the local area. And by the end, as I saw with Graham, you become a specialist in all these inner workings, which just, you know, you wouldn't get if you were working in, I don't know, Somerset, you know? It's
the bizarre thing in Libya currently is we have to say, when I said you have to get permission, there isn't fieldwork going on in Libya now because there's the security situation. I mean, with non-Libyans working there isn't any. But the Libyan friends I have in the Department of Antiquities, you have a departmental office, because you know Libya has two governments, three by some standards. So you have an office of the Antiquities Department, say in Cyrene or Benghazi, and they're paid by one of the governments, thankfully, but when they write their reports, there are two heads of the department. There's the head of the department of that government, head of the department of that government. So the reports they write have to go to the two governments. So there is a bureaucracy managing to keep Libya going in a world in which they have at least two governments with all these competing militias. I mean, the lives of the people there do give you huge hope for the kind of resilience that they have to deal with.
And it's kind of worth, no, it's also just worth pointing out with resilience that we're talking about these places like they're absolutely, you know, but the truth is, you know, my cousins are in Yemen right now. They're having weddings.
Yeah.
They're all giving birth. I mean, don't get me wrong.
People are taking children to school.
Yeah.
Life goes on against all the odds. Life goes on.
And that's the point I was going to make, actually. Because not only is it about collaborating with people who are in the country, who know the country. You know, I could speak to various experiences that are similar to that, but it's also about thinking about risk, you know, because the people who are there, like you say, are far more accepting of certain risks because this is there every day, you know, and when we're working in collaborations as well, you know, sometimes I've had these interesting conversations where I'm like, okay, I think we need to stop the interviews, and the people, you know, in Myanmar because of, you know, everything that's happened, and they were like, no, this is absolutely, we can't stop, you know, and these are activist researchers and they know their country, and so, you know, sort of their risk line was much further down the line. I'm like, oh, I don't feel really comfortable about this. You know, you're having to do things secretly, arrange secretly to meet with garment workers. Some of the garment workers are, you know, sort of recording the factories. This is really dangerous. But then, you know, they're like, well, life is dangerous. Life is dangerous for us, and we just have to live it, you know? So, yeah, you have to encompass all of those views.
Yeah, I mean, like, just look at us right now, right? Some of us are leaving the houses. Yeah, let's be honest, how many people in this room I've heard two of my friends go, actually, I'm not leaving and going into central London right now. Everybody's risk lines are different, right? Some of you are looking at me like I'm crazy. It's just my friends, apparently. But everybody's risk line is different. And actually, for a lot of people in these places, you know, this is just everyday life.
And I think they are exhilarating places to work in, basically, because the people are inspiring. They live lives that you and I would despair with, in one sense, but they have, the golden rules most seem to be keep out of the way of government, have a very strong family because everything works on family, and most of all have an extraordinary sense of humour, that you see humour in situations that would just leave us aghast on a daily basis. And the relationships we have with Kurds, with Libyans, and like that, they are extraordinarily life-enhancing. And Syria will be another place like that, just where people continue to have a kind of a hope about it all.
That's probably a really nice, inspirational way to end. And I think we do have to end. The Royal Society is going to start to say no to us, have to go home. I think it just comes down to me to thank our panelists. And I think the three of them could teach a sort of advanced course on how to do science in any part of the world, but especially on the front line. Also want to thank you for all the risks you took to get here tonight. And thank you for your questions. And I suppose just want to finish up by saying the Royal Society puts on lots of events, and if you want to learn any more about them, you can just visit the Royal Society website. So thank you very much for coming on tonight.
Yeah, thank you.